Welcome to Family History Mysteries, a podcast that tells the stories uncovered through family history research, the unexpected stories of everyday people. I am an avid family historian who has been compiling my family tree for over 15 years, with nearly 20,000 people recorded in my trees.
Episode 111, Baby Farmer. In 1907, Perth woman Alice Mitchell was arrested for the murder of 5-month-old Ethel Booth. During the inquest and subsequent trial, the citizens of Western Australia were horrified to learn that at least 37 infants had died in Mitchell's care in the previous 6 years. It became clear that she'd been running a baby farm, making a profit out of caring for the children of single mothers and other unfortunate women. Baby farm was a term for someone who took infants in of single mothers and unfortunate families for a fee, with little or no concern for the child's welfare. It was like the beginnings of creche or daycare, but often with tragic results. Alice Mitchell was born Alice Hammond in Perth in 1855. She was the daughter of John Enoch Weston Hammond and Hannah Eliza Leader. Her father, John Hammond, was English and was born in 1827. He served in the 96th Regiment of Foot until his discharge in 1849, after he had arrived in Perth 9 months prior. In 1852, he became a police constable. He had 3 children with Hannah Leader prior to their marriage in Perth in October 1858, and another child in 1859. John was 9 years younger than Hannah. He also worked as a gardener at Pinjarra and a brickmaker in Perth, as well as a teamster in 1882. John Enoch Hammond died in September 1892, and his death notice states John Enoch Hammond at Northam, Western Australia, in his 67th year through a fall of earth. His wife, Hannah Eliza Leader, was born on the 6th of March 1818 at Bury, St Edmunds, Suffolk, England. She immigrated to Western Australia on the Rockingham with her parents when she was 11 in May 1830. Leaderville is named after her father, William Leader. Hannah Leader married Charles Foster Clarkson initially, an Englishman who arrived with his father on the Cygnet in 1833. They married in March 1837 in Perth and had 7 children. They moved to Melbourne on board the Lord Hobart in April 1838 and then returned to Western Australia in June 1841. In 1843, they built the first 2-storey home on the waterfront in Perth and held the Commercial Inn in 1844. Charles Clarkson headed over to the Victorian goldfields on the 10th of March 1852, but he died in December 1853 of tuberculosis in Ballarat, Victoria, aged only 41. Their youngest child was only 2 years old. The same year that her husband died in Victoria, she had her first child in Western Australia with John Hammond. Alice was the second child of 4 that was born to John Hammond and Hannah Leader. Alice had 2 children illegitimately. The first child was when she was 19. She had Evelina May Hammond, who was born in Perth in May 1874 and died on the 30th of November 1874. The cause of death on her death certificate was teething. No father was listed on her birth certificate. The second child she had was Elma Evelyn May Hammond, born in 2J, Western Australia, on the 13th of July 1876. It does state that she was the daughter of Alice Matilda Hammond and John Joseph Goodman. There was a Thomas Goodman living in York around this time. He married Ellen Gorman in the same year that this baby was born. Elma went on to marry George Slinger in Guildford in 1897. George was a newspaper compositor and they lived in North Perth. They had 2 children, and Elma died in 1925 in Perth, aged only 49. Her death certificate states that she was the daughter of John Reed and Matilda Hammond. Alice then went on to marry George Reed on the 23rd of February 1878 in York, Western Australia, when she was 23 and George was 46. George was English and had been convicted of housebreaking on the 7th of January 1859 at Newcastle, Northumberland, England. This was not his first conviction, and he was sentenced to 8 years transportation to Western Australia. He arrived on board the Palmerston on the 11th of February 1861 and was described as unmarried, semi-literate, and his occupation was a sweep. He was sent for service to York on the 13th of June 1865, and his sentence expired on the 6th of January 1867, receiving a certificate of freedom at York on the 23rd of December 1869. Alice and George Reed's children. The first was Jesse George Reed, who was born in Perth in 1879. He enlisted in World War I in December 1914 and married Florence Eliza Shaw in Leederville on the 15th of February 1915 before embarking from Fremantle 2 days later. He served in the 3rd Light Horse at Gallipoli in Egypt, and he contracted malaria and was sent back to Australia on the 29th of April 1919. Jesse and Florence separated in December 1920. There was an article in the Perth Truth on the 13th of August 1921 titled "Another Aussie Strikes Surprise Packet, a Greatly Forgiving Husband and Unappreciative Woman." When George Jesse Reed came home from the war after 4 long years, he resumed cohabitation with his wife, Florence Eliza, and began to thank his lucky stars that of the virtuous war wives he possessed one. But like sundry other poor diggers, George had made a mistake. In straight language, he counted the chickens before the eggs were hatched. He discovered after a week or two that during his absence, Eliza had taken onto herself a temporary husband and had rewarded him with the birth of a young Aussie. George found out all but one thing, and that was the name of the invader of his matrimonial sanctity. Eliza was caught in an act of misconduct with a strange man under cover of night and shielded, as the sinners thought, by surrounding clumps of scrub. What followed is best told by George himself, with his evidence before Mr. Justice Burnside, when he proceeded for divorce on Tuesday last on the grounds of his wife's adultery. The petitioner, who was represented by M.G. Lavin, stated that he married the respondent in February 1915 at Fremantle, and after 2 days only, he departed for the seat of war. 4 years later, he came back and lived with his wife at Tower Street. She told him that she was the happiest woman in the world, glad to have him back home again, and all that sort of thing. George took it all in readily, taking her to his heart, but alas, her sin found her out. For some means not disclosed, George found that she had given birth to a child on the 11th of April 1917. She confessed her guilt, but he forgave her on the solemn promise to lead a straight life. But it was not long before she forgot her vows by sneaking off one afternoon and staying away for 2 whole nights. When she returned, he demanded to know her game, but she declined to explain. He knew then that she would never be true to him. He decided to clear out and leave her to it. The next thing was that she sued him for support and maintenance at the city court on the grounds of his desertion, and he was ordered to pay up. From that time onwards, he watched her conduct closely, and as a result of what he learned, he employed Private Detective Cleary, and the two of them set out to shadow the erring Eliza. They found out that she was living with her mother in Egan Street, North Perth. On Sunday the 19th of June of this year, the two of them approached the house and stowed themselves away at a point of advantage. That was about 8 in the evening. After watching all the comings and goings for 2.5 hours, their vigilance was rewarded. From the thicket on the left, they saw 2 forms coming out of the gloom. As they came closer, the witness saw that it was his wife, but he could not make out who her companion was. From the vacant allotment, they proceeded to shadow cast by some trees in the street, where they stood for a space of 10 minutes, hugging and kissing each other. Then Eliza went into the house and the man left. The watchers also took themselves off, only to return the following Sunday evening and conceal themselves at a likely spot in the scrub. They kept as quiet as mice for 2 hours, and then they suddenly spotted a man and a woman making for the thicket. They came along arm in arm and appeared to be really affectionate. True enough, it was Eliza and her Romeo. After casting about them for a second or two, they selected a cosy spot for the next 5 minutes, and the watchers were treated to a hugging and kissing show free of charge. They then went to leave. The lovers, hearing the noise, jumped up in a startled fashion and scampered away into the darkness. Where the man went, they could not say, but a few minutes later he saw his wife entering the front gate. George then approached her and asked her who the man was, and she laughed and she said, "You and your mate have been trying to trap him, but he's given you the slip. He left on the train tonight." Where to, she never stated. A few days later she came up to him and Cleary in the street and asked, "Well, what are you going to do about it?" The petitioner made answer, "Get a divorce, of course," of which she replied, "I'll be very glad to do so. I'm sick of this." Cleary then asked her if she was prepared to sign a statement, and she did, and she wrote, "I, Florence Eliza Reed, committed adultery with a man whose name I will not divulge because he didn't know I was a married woman." Private Detective Albert Cleary corroborated the story of what took place in the scrub and explained that the house occupied by the respondent was a small one with only one bedroom. Her mother and father occupied the bedroom while the respondent stopped in a lobby. She admitted to witness that she had committed adultery with the man she was with in the scrub, and further remarked that she'd been out with various other men at different times. A decree nisi was granted. He then married Florence's sister, Alice Josephine Shaw, in 1922 in Perth. They had 5 children. George was the caretaker of Wollongong Weir, and he died on the 16th of December 1954 at Canning, aged 75. His mother, Alice Mitchell, then went on to marry John Sweeney and had the following children. Florence Susanna Reid was born in March 1881 in York. She died at 2 years and 10 months of measles in Perth and is buried as Florence S. Sweeney. By this stage, Alice had left George Reid and was living with John Matthew Sweeney, so it's quite possible Florence was John Sweeney's child. Alice and John had been living together since around 1880. John Sweeney was born in 1834, so was 21 years older than Alice. The next child was John Matthew Sweeney, who was born in 1882 in Perth and died on the 14th of January 1884 in Perth. The next child, Alice Ruth Sweeney, was born in Perth in 1884. She married Enos William Hall at the Wesley Manse in Perth on the 11th of December 1901. They had 7 children, and Alice died on the 22nd of January 1947 at Subiaco, aged 62. The 7th child that Alice had was Rose Ann Sweeney, who was born in 1886 in Perth. She married Frederick Edward Gent in Perth in 1903. Fred was a bookmaker and they had 6 children. Rose died on the 5th of April 1961 at Mount Lawley, aged 74. And the 8th child was John Matthew Burnett Sweeney, and he was born on the 22nd of September 1887 in Perth. He died on the 3rd of April 1919 in Victoria, aged only 31, under the name John Reid. In 1892, Alice took John Sweeney to court for maintenance. It's on the 4th of August 1892 in the West Australian in Perth. Another affiliation case. At the City Police Court yesterday, an elderly woman named Alice Reid, just to note she's actually only 37 at this stage, proceeded against John Sweeney for the maintenance of her illegitimate child, aged 5 years. Alice Reid, a married woman, stated that she was the applicant. On the 22nd of September 1887, she was delivered of a male child, of which the defendant was the father. The witness and the defendant had been living together as man and wife for 12 years. The witness had 4 children by the defendant. 3 of these were still alive. Dr. Kenny attended her during her illness, and the defendant had given her the money with to pay the doctor. After the birth of the last child, the witness continued to live with the defendant until the 29th of June 1891, and immediately after the birth of the child, the witness received money from him. Up until June 1891, defendant had clothed and supported the children, making payments in cash to witness. Since the witness had been trying to support herself with 1 or 2 boarders, the defendant came to the house and abused them and they left. For the last 3 weeks, the children had been next to starving. The witness was told the defendant earned 12 shillings 9 pence a day as a bricklayer and a stonemason. His average wages when he was living with her were 10 shillings a day. The child for whose support she was now applying was at present time destitute of food and clothes. Witness had tried her best to earn a living for the children. Witness and her children were living in a 2-storied house for which she paid 10 shillings 6 pence a week rent. She had been keeping boarders, but they had left her. Her husband, Reid, was in the depot. Her reason for leaving the defendant was that he ill-treated her and abused her, called her names she did not deserve. He had struck her in the face. Up till 3 weeks ago, she had boarders in her house. And she was asked, "Are you not living at present time with one of them?" She said, "No, and Sweeney is the father of my children." "How did you come to leave your lawful husband, Reid?" "Because he was just another husband as this." Mr. Cohen said it seemed to him from what he knew of the case that the woman desired the defendant either to keep away from her altogether or to contribute towards the support of the children. The complainant would enter into no more contracts with the defendant as they were always broken. Mr. Cohen suggested the children might be placed in an orphanage. James Barber, a bricklayer, was called to prove that the complainant and Sweeney had cohabited as man and wife. He said he'd known them about 5 years ago, and 2 weeks after the little boy was born, and then they were living in the same house together. He did not know then whether they were man or wife or not. Mr. Moorhead for the defence moved for a non-suit. He submitted that there was no evidence to corroborate the statement that the defendant was the father of the child. They must have evidence to show that the complainant was seen with the defendant on a certain date before the birth of the child. Mr. Haynes in reply submitted that there was no need for corroborative evidence when it was proved the man had paid for the support of the child. In such a case, the evidence of the mother on oath was sufficient. Mr. Cohen said that it was within his own knowledge, apart from any evidence produced them, that the man had been living with the complainant, but apart from this altogether, he thought there was sufficient evidence to go on with the case. John Sweeney, the defendant, who stated that he'd known the complainant, Alice Reid, for as long as 11 or 12 years. About 5 years ago, he was living in the same house with her. He was boarding there. The result was a small family, but by whom he could not say. During the 11 years, he was on several occasions up in the north of the colony, and at the time the last child was born, he was working in the hills. He was also working in the hills about 8 or 9 months before the child was born. Since the child was born, he had given the complainant money. He gave it to her to do whatever she liked with. When he went to work in the hills for Mr. Lowton at Spring Hill, he left the complainant in a house furnished by him. Mr. Cohen said he thought the parties might come to some arrangement by which the defendant might take charge of the children. The witness said, "I would take the boy and put him in a monastery." Mr. Haynes, on behalf of the complainant, said he would not agree to this. And Mr. Cohen, addressing the defendant, said, "If the children are yours, you must contribute towards their support. If a man will go in for these sort of luxuries, he must pay for them. However, if no arrangement can be made between the parties, I must make an order in favour of the complainant. I think some arrangement might be made with regard to the children, who appear to be in great misery." The defendant said, "Let her give over the boarding house and I will keep the whole lot of them. After I went to the northwest, I came back and found a respectable boarder in the house and had to chuck him out. I want no boarders in my house." After further discussion, the bench made an order for 5 shillings a week and costs. Alice then married Charles Adam Mitchell, a Scotsman who'd been in the Navy in 1901 in Perth. He was 6 years younger than Alice. Other family trees have Charles Mitchell as an African-American man from San Francisco. In the Daily News in Perth on the 6th of March 1907, there is an article based on an inquest. And the title of the article says, "The worst conditions he has ever seen. Mrs. Mitchell admits it's a baby farm." The inquest touching the death of Ethel Booth. Carl Rue, a painter and decorator residing in Perth, stated he was acquainted with Mrs. Mitchell. He stayed as a lodger at her house from the middle of January to the middle of July 1906. He left then and then returned in November of the same year, remaining until the 18th of February 1907. The first time he stayed at Mrs. Mitchell's, he boarded there, and on the second occasion, he and his wife hired one of the front rooms, for which he paid 8 shillings per week. The witness remembered the infant Booth being brought into Mrs. Mitchell's. It was then a fine, healthy child, and Mrs. Mitchell had said to him it was one of the best she had seen, and she was proud of it. At the start, the child was kept in one of the back rooms, there being a good many children in the same room. He thought at the time baby Booth was taken there were 7 or 8 children in the room, which was also occupied by Mr. and Mrs. Mitchell. At that time, there were 3 beds, a double bed, a single bed and a baby's cot in the room, which only had one window that looked over the backyard. There was no blind on the window until witness himself put one up at the request of Mrs. Mitchell about a week before she was arrested. The infant Booth did not improve under Mrs. Mitchell's charge. It first got sore eyes and then became sick. The witness did not see the baby much after it became sick. Inspector Selinger asked what was the state of the room, and the witness said, "Well, Mrs. Mitchell was always kind to me, but the truth cannot be denied." Language could not picture the misery of the room. He said whenever he saw the room it was untidy. He did not think the beds were ever made, and the babies were lying anyway on the bed. The bedclothes were in a state of disorder. The sun used to shine on the babies' faces as they lay in the bed, and every time he went into the room, their faces were covered with flies. He had mentioned the matter to Mrs. Mitchell, but she said she could not keep the flies out. The sick and healthy were kept in the same room, but occasionally when one got very bad, it was taken to another room. Where were the children taken when they were dying? He said they were kept with the other children. He had seen the baby's napkins lying in a corner of the room in heaps. Mrs. Mitchell asked the witness for a cardboard box, and this she afterwards used to put them in. It was a common thing to see them lying in the room. He'd seen the infant Brown taken onto the veranda 2 or 3 times. It used to lie on a pillow and it was just able to move its head. This was in the evenings. Were these children ever taken out for outings? The witness said, I never saw them. He heard Mitchell tell his wife on several occasions that the place looked like a pigsty. Mr. Mitchell used to turn to on Sunday and clean the house and the backyard in which the fowls used to run about. During the week, the yard was very dirty, with slops and rubbish being emptied into it. There was no drain. Witness knew a girl named Susie who used to be at Mitchell's. Susie was very dirty, and the witness heard that she'd had 6 children and they all died. Susie had a sore on her lips, and the witness asked Mrs. Mitchell what it was, and she said it was syphilis. Susie used to nurse the babies. The witness told Mrs. Mitchell to be careful and not let Susie touch the babies while she was in that state. Mrs. Mitchell said she wanted to get Susie to the hospital, but she would not go. His wife drew attention to the fact that Susie was full of vermin, and on looking he saw it was so. He then told Mrs. Mitchell if she did not get rid of Susie, he would go. He saw the vermin running about Susie's hair and neck, and she had sores on her neck. The coroner asked, did Susie cook the meals? And the witness said yes, cooked everything and made the children's food. She did not cook my meals. My wife used to do that. On one occasion, Mrs. Mitchell saturated her hair with kerosene. Mrs. Mitchell's married daughter, her husband and 2 children were staying in the house, and they got vermin on them. All the babies got sore eyes about a week after they came into the house. Their faces also became drawn and thin. Did all the children die? Asked the coroner. The witness said, I know while I was there, 9 of the children died, 6 in the house, 2 in hospital, and 1 after it was taken away with its mother. Inspector Selinger informed the coroner that as far as he could ascertain, 32 out of 35 children had died. The fowls Mrs. Mitchell kept used to run about the house. Witness had told Mrs. Mitchell that if she got a wire door, he would put it up to keep the fowls out. She promised to get it, but never did. The fowls used to get into the baby's room. 2 little children named Phyllis and Mick, who were each about 2 years old, used to crawl about the house and the backyard and would become in a filthy condition. Sometimes he noticed them wearing, instead of an ordinary napkin, something that looked like bagging. Several times he had, owing to having seen the children picking up and eating stuff, including fowl droppings. He told Mrs. Mitchell of this, but she only smiled. He heard Mrs. Gent complain to her mother about the way she was looking after the children. Mrs. Gent said to Mrs. Mitchell that she was too damn lazy to look after them. He saw Mrs. Mitchell with a carving knife in her hand, and they were all shouting. The witness had seen the lady inspector, Mrs. Lynham, visit the house 2 or 3 times. She always seemed in a hurry, and he'd only seen her go through the premises once. He had seen her there 6 times altogether. The longest time she stayed, so far as the witness knew, was 5 minutes. The witness had seen Mrs. Mitchell bathing the children. He had seen her bathe 1 child and use the same water for the 2nd child. Sometimes she would be without wood for weeks at a time and couldn't heat water. The witness saw Mrs. Mitchell the night she was released on bail. He saw her at her daughter's place first, and then she came afterwards to his room. On that occasion, Mrs. Mitchell said that if she fell, Dr. Officer would have to fall too. Inspector Selinger said, Mr. Rue, from what you have seen when you were at the house, do you consider those infants were looked after properly? And the witness said, no, I do not. He had known Mrs. Mitchell to be away from home for a day, and at such times Susie would look after the children. He had once seen Susie go into the room when Mrs. Mitchell was away, saw her pick up the child, either Baby Booth or Baby Brown, shake it and throw it down in the cot again. When Baby Booth was taken to hospital by its mother, he heard Mrs. Mitchell blaming Mrs. Gent for having given the show away. As a rule, when the mothers of the children used to call to see them, Mrs. Mitchell would refuse to allow them to do so and tell them they were asleep. And on the 13th of April 1907, in the Adelaide Chronicle, the title of the article is Birth Baby Farming Case, a dreadful record, 38 deaths in 43 cases in Perth. At the criminal court today, the trial of Alice Mitchell, on a charge of having at Perth on the 11th of January murdered an infant, Ethel Booth, who had been placed in her charge by its mother, was begun. Corporal O'Halloran said he asked Mitchell for a record of the children that she'd taken charge of, and she gave him the list produced. The record started from December 1902 and finished in December 1904. There were no particulars of any children taken in after that date. The whole of the first 13 children on this record had died without exception. 23 names are on the list, and out of these, 23 witnesses had traced 19 as having died. He had only been able to find 2 alive between 1901 and 1907. He had traced the certificates of death of 37 children, of whom Mrs. Mitchell had had charge. That of the baby Booth was not included in these. The witness had found that the total number of children Mrs. Mitchell had charge of during that same period was 43. So far as the witness could trace, 38 children out of 43 had died from 1901 to 1907. Cross-examined, the witness said he could not tell how many children Mrs. Mitchell had actually charge of. He had taken the number of deaths from the records and death certificates and the number who had lived from the register alone. There might have been others who had lived, but he could not trace any more. The witness was then examined as to certain children, the names of whom Mr. Beresford read from a list. In some cases, the witness had proceeded to the addresses given in the register supplied by Mrs. Mitchell of the mothers of the infants, but could find no trace of these mothers, nor that they ever lived at the addresses specified. The names mentioned by Mr. Beresford did not appear in the Board of Health register or the register supplied by Mrs. Mitchell. They did not alter the figures that he had supplied, that out of 43 cases he personally investigated 38 who died. Dr. Officer was the next witness. He said in 1904, when Mrs. Mitchell lived at Beaufort Street, the witness, owing to the condition of a child she'd taken in, told her he would not attend children at her house unless he previously examined them. Since then, he'd examined all the children, and he attended at Mrs. Mitchell's either at the time of or shortly after their admission. He did not know whether he had been the only doctor who attended the children at Mrs. Mitchell since 1904. During that time, he might have attended 30 infants at Mrs. Mitchell's house, and of these he believed 22 had died, and he had given death certificates for them. The baby Booth had suffered from intermittent diarrhoea. He said that to the best of his knowledge, his instructions had been carried out by Mrs. Mitchell. He never saw the child dirty and never discovered any neglect. Dr. Timms at the Perth Hospital deposed that the child Booth died of chronic starvation. Dr. Frederick Hitch stated that in March 1904 he resided in Beaufort Street. In the early part of that year, he was called to Mrs. Mitchell's house to see a child, which was emaciated, as well as he could remember had bronchitis. Shortly afterwards, he attended a second child, which was also emaciated. He examined him and found nothing to account for his condition. Dr. Davey gave evidence that when he saw the babies, Booth and Brown, at Mitchell's, were both emaciated and dirty, and the smell was awful. He assisted Dr. Timms at the post-mortem. In his opinion, the deceased died of starvation. Dr. O.S. Taft stated that in October 1902 he attended the infant Scott at Mitchell's. The child was very much emaciated. He attended her a good many times and she improved. He then ceased calling, but he was summoned to attend the same child at a much later period. He found her again wasted, and he asked Mrs. Mitchell why he was not notified of the change in the child's condition sooner. Mrs. Mitchell stated that the child was suffering from diarrhoea and teething, which accounted for her awful condition. The child died within a few days. He also attended 2 other children who died. Afterwards, he received another call to Mitchell's and he refused to go. He was asked, what in your opinion was the cause of death of these 3 children? And he said starvation. Mrs. Mitchell was examined. The accused, who gave evidence on oath, said the child Booth, when brought to her, was suffering from a bad cough and diarrhoea. She administered a dose of castor oil, reduced the quantity of milk and gave the baby rice water. On the 4th or 5th of January, Dr. Officer was sent for and he told witness to change the Nestlé's milk food to Allenbury's food. The doctor came again on January 18th or 19th and witness told him that the diarrhoea was continued and medicine was ordered. The child improved slightly, but a little later it began to vomit. When the doctor next saw the infant, he advised the witness to change to number 2 Allenbury's food for number 1. After his next visit, the doctor ordered that all food should be stopped and to give the baby white of egg and sherry whey. The child improved and the doctor said she might have a teaspoonful of Nestlé's milk to 6 teaspoonfuls of water. The next day there was a marked improvement and the doctor ordered a double quantity of this diet, which upset the child altogether. The soiled baby linen that was said to have been seen in the wash house did not come from any of the children at her place. She'd always taken great care of baby Booth. In fact, she never entrusted the care of young babies to anyone else. She bathed the children in the mornings and sponged them in the evenings. When Corporal O'Halloran and Dr. Davey visited the house, they did not complain of the room which they inspected. Only on one occasion was baby Booth's mother refused permission to see the child. The baby Brown commenced to waste when it was cutting its double teeth. The mother of that child paid for its keep for a period of 6 weeks, and then she lost sight of until she was seen again in court. She now owed the witness £7. The clergyman witness, Mr. Craggs, did not ask her if it was a baby farm, but what really happened was that she told that gentleman that she took in the babies to nurse. She admitted having been careless with regard to her register. She had a list of children still living who had been under her care during the past 5 years. The children admitted to her house had received every plausible attention. A child entered on her register as Bullman was called Moran on the death certificate. A different name had been given at each address. 2 children named Warby and McAllery were received on the same day and died together some weeks afterwards. The child Warby was certified as Dally. She was asked, "Are you prepared to say that these 37 death certificates that have been produced do not all refer to children who were under your care?" And she said some of them were under the care of their mothers and were all not under my care. She stated that the child Turvey, which was certified to by Dr. Officer as having died of congenital specific disease, was a child of Susie Turvey's. She attended the girl Turvey in her confinement when her child Harry was born. Dr. Officer attended her all the time. And Dr. Officer told us that he knew nothing about the child Harry Turvey. If the child Booth was not very well when you received it, why did you delay for a week before you sent for Dr. Officer? She said, "I thought the castor oil would be sufficient." Do you agree that Dr. Officer saw this baby on the 5th of January and not again to the 18th of January? And she said, "Yes, that's quite correct." Then Mr. Barker produced a document and said, "Dr. Officer, you saw baby Booth on the 5th of January when you put it on number 2 food. You next saw it on the 9th and next on the 13th. Now, I gave you every opportunity. I asked you 3 times and you persisted in agreeing that Dr. Officer had not seen the baby from the 5th of January to the 18th of January, and you wrote to a witness while under examination telling him what evidence he was to give." Mr. Barker then produced a letter which was as follows. "Dr. Officer, you first saw baby Booth on the 5th of January and put it on number 2 food. You next saw it on the 9th and then the 13th and changed the food to number 1, finding number 2 too strong. You next saw it on the 20th. Then you ordered it to be taken off Ellenbury's food and put on barley water, white of egg, sherry away and brandy at times. You next saw it on the 24th from the time you saw it 3 times a week till the last week, and then you saw it every day up to the day it left to go to the hospital. When it improved a little, you ordered it a teaspoon of Nestlé's milk to 24 teaspoonfuls of barley water. Finding it brought on diarrhea again, you put it back on barley water, white of egg and sherry whey. I never said at any time the child was teething." Signed, A. Mitchell. Mr. Barker asked her, "Do you know that Dr. Officer said that he is sure he did not see the baby from the 20th of January to the 4th of February? "Yes." "And here you tell him that he saw it on the 20th and the 24th, and from thence 3 times a week. Do you know that Dr. Officer never said a word about sherry whey?" She said, "I don't remember." "You had every opportunity of asking him when he was giving his evidence. You were frequently conversing with your counsel, and you could have got him to ask the doctor if he had not prescribed sherry whey." She said, "He did order sherry whey." "Well, he didn't tell us, and your counsel didn't ask him." Continuing, she said, she could not remember Dr. Taff refusing to attend any more of her children, but she would not deny the evidence. "Was there some ill feeling between you and the witness Carl Rue?" She said, "Yes, we had 2 or 3 quarrels." "Were you surprised that when you were admitted to bail, a man with whom you were on such terms should throw his arm around your neck, kiss you and say, 'Oh, mother, we are glad to see you here'?" "Yes, I was." "How many houses have you lived in since you were registered?" 6 or 7. "Did the inspector or anyone else tell you how many children you should keep in your house?" "No." "Did you furnish any returns or give information to anyone respecting the number of children you had?" She said no. The summing up, His Honour said that the accused was carrying on a business what was known as baby farming, defined as a place where the care and nourishment of babies was undertaken for hire. Baby farming had for a long time past been recognised as a calling, which presented many temptations for the neglect of children, particularly illegitimate children. The woman carrying on this dangerous business of baby farming in a house in East Perth, situated in low-lying swampy grounds. Everyone had said that this was an unhealthy locality, and it was possible, therefore, for the business to be carried on in the midst of unhealthy surroundings. Nobody seemed to carry out the duty of ascertaining how many children were kept by a woman licensed under the Act. She could not only fill a house with babies, but she could take in maternity cases, and after that as many female and male lodgers as she could get. Whatever the result of this case might be, it might be hoped that other steps would be taken to make the work of the infant life protection clauses of the Act effective, or baby farming would have to be done with altogether. If his opinion was of any value, he would say the only remedy was to do away with baby farming altogether. He doubted very much whether they would be able to make satisfactory conditions where young children were being kept in a climate like that of Western Australia by persons for the purpose of making a living and not for the love of it. Turning to the case of the accused woman, on the more serious charge it was their duty to see if they could find anything which showed that the accused actually intended to take life. If they once found that she'd been guilty of negligence of some kind, they were entitled to consider the history of those other children who had lived and died in her homes. In this case, common sense and common law were one and the same, but on the other hand, Mr. Beresford had called witnesses who had given contradictory evidence. If they accepted the story of Mrs. Mitchell, then there had been no neglect, and the death of the child was pure misfortune. She had lived in a good many houses, each of them registered and visited by inspectors, and she had called in medical men to attend the children. They must not, however, allow the case to be decided by the medical men who were called in or by the inspectors. If there had been neglect which had been overlooked by those people who ought to have discovered it, it was their duty to say so. The evidence of Carl Rue and his wife had an important bearing on the case. Rue was the most important witness, and on view placed upon his evidence would depend the result of the case. It was for them to look into the evidence and the manner in which he gave it, and say whether they believed he was an honest witness or not. Regarding Dr. Officer's evidence, His Honour said that Dr. Officer might have thought there was no reason why he should trouble himself about the condition of the house, because it was registered and inspectors were appointed to examine the condition of such house. There was no reason for suggesting that Dr. Officer was guilty of any neglect at all. He was not guilty of greater neglect than that he omitted to make inquiries, which perhaps he thought, over the matter a little bit more, he would have done. He may have been too easygoing or too busy, and he may have been misled because it was a house that ought to have been looked after by some other person. After dealing with other portions of the evidence, His Honour said a baby could be killed by withholding food from it altogether, by giving it improper food, by giving it proper food under improper conditions, or by the surroundings in which it was kept. If they thought that any act or omission of the accused had caused the death of those children, then it may be in certain circumstances be murder or manslaughter. If they found that the accused by starving or improper treatment caused their death, then she was guilty of willful murder. He should think that they would hesitate very much before they found her guilty of a crime of willful murder. He was not prepared to say there was no evidence against her. If he were, he would withdraw the major charge, but he was not prepared to go that far. She was guilty of manslaughter if they thought there had been evidence of neglect of a certain character, that the death of this particular child was caused or accelerated by any neglect on her part that reasonably ought to be punished. In reply to the foreman, His Honour said that the children had died from stomach trouble. The evidence went to show that neglect would cause stomach trouble. That was the point where the jury would have to decide for themselves. And the verdict? The foreman said, "We find the prisoner guilty of manslaughter. We also wish to add a rider to the effect that Your Honour bring under the notice of proper authorities the disgraceful neglect in the administration of infant life protection clauses of the Act as shown in this case." Mrs. Mitchell, who was unmoved when the verdict was given, quietly answered no when asked if she had anything to say why the sentence should not be passed on to her. And the sentence, His Honour addressing the prisoner said, "Alice Mitchell, the jury have found you guilty of manslaughter. They've come to the conclusion that you had no intention of killing this baby Booth, but the death was caused by your criminal negligence. That is a verdict in which I entirely agree. It has been a very painful case from the commencement, and I have found a very great difficulty in coming to a conclusion as what sentence I should pass on to you. I have only to sentence you for the death of this one child, but in order to see what your conduct has been, I am entitled to look at the surrounding circumstances and the manner of which you have conducted the business you've been carrying on. It has been very painful to look at a long roll of children who've died while under your charge, and it is still more painful to consider what their suffering might have been while they were dying. In most cases, death must have been to them a happy release. I'm quite satisfied in my mind that for years past you have been like many other women who carry on the same business, perfectly callous to the sufferings of these children who are entrusted in your care. Your only object was to make a living out of the business and to keep out of the clutches of the law, and I am afraid that you fully appreciate how easy the work was made for you by the neglect of those duty it was to see that you cared for the children. You traded on in that neglect, and the law for the protection of infant life became a law for the protection of yourself. I can find very little to justify myself in extending to you the mercy I would like to show. All that can be said in your favour is that you are a woman getting on in life, and therefore whatever term of imprisonment I may pass on to you will affect you much more severely than it would a younger woman. Still, I must sentence you to such a term of imprisonment as you will not only punish you for your misconduct, but will warn others who may be running the same risk you have been running. In another case, should the accused be a young woman, she will not leave the box with such a light sentence of which I am about to pass on to you, which is one of imprisonment with hard labour for 5 years. The accused heard the sentence with just a suspicion of anxiety, and she walked firmly down the steps leading from the dock. The Alice Mitchell murder trial gripped the city of Perth and the nation. On everyone's mind was, how did it come to this? Why did the doctor who signed most of the death certificates fail to raise any alarm? And why did the health inspectors who regularly visited her home allow her to go on taking babies? So her husband Charles was listed as living with Alice in Perth in 1915 and 1917, so after she was released from jail, and Alice died on the 2nd of January 1919 in East Perth at the age of 63. And Alice's siblings, John Everett Hammond was born in 1853 at Mongers Lake near Leederville, Western Australia, and he married Maria Herbert in Fremantle in September 1876. They had 6 children, 3 surviving into adulthood. John served in World War I at the age of 65. He was a munitions worker and he returned in October 1918. And he died in June 1926. And it says the death of an old colonist. Mr. John Hammond, a very old resident of Western Australia, died at Busselton in his 73rd year. He was born at Mongers Lake and served an apprenticeship in carpentry with Noonan and Brophy building contractors at Perth. While he was in his youth, was in charge of a gang of men at the erection of the telephone line from Perth to Geraldton. Towards the end of 1873, he was in a number of a party of 10 who took a big mob of cattle to the northwest on the Gascoyne River with Henry and William Clarkson, 2 of the late Mr. Hammond's half-brothers, who went forward to march for water while the remainder of the party remained in camp. Some days later, the 2 Clarkson brothers were found dead, one of them having been speared by natives and the other one having died. Later, Mr. Hammond went to the eastern states and remained there for 20 years. He was engaged for some time in the construction of the Great Western Railway. So the Clarkson Party was organised by the late Henry James Clarkson, who went to the northwest in 1872. After some time there, Mr. Clarkson was commissioned by Mackenzie Grant, Anderson and Charles Harper to go to the southwest to buy stock for their stations. It was considered a brave undertaking in those days, as the natives were at their worst. He perished on the return trip with the stock. Mr. Clarkson realised that the task of getting stock overland that season was a big one because feed and water was very scarce. During the final leg of the trip, 15 months since leaving Albany, the brothers Clarkson went ahead of the main party to explore and taking a native of that area with them to show them watering places. Things were fairly satisfactory until they arrived at Hawley's Well, 40 miles away, when the native took them in an easterly direction about another 40 miles without leading them to water. On that night, the natives stole away and left them with one of their horses. It appeared the Clarkson brothers tried to reach the main camp on the other horse, but William Clarkson became exhausted 25 miles east of Hawley's Well and could not travel further, and his brother had to leave him to try and reach the well. The unfortunate man had only travelled 3 miles from his brother when his horse gave out. He thought he might reach the well by walking. He filled his water bags and walked for a couple of miles, sat down to rest under the shade of a bush and dropped off to sleep. Some natives seen him pass, and when he fell asleep, he was pounced on and they killed him. Although he had a fully loaded revolver, he had no chance to use it. And it's believed that William Clarkson perished from exhaustion and thirst soon after his brother left him. Alice's other brother, Jesse Elijah Hammond, was born on the 6th of June 1856 in Perth. As a child, he worked as a butcher boy, a baker boy, and then a shop assistant, and at the age of 15, he was an apprentice bricklayer. In 1874, he joined his brother and half-brothers, and he became a builder in Geraldton, Northam and Kelmscott. He married Anna Retta Gordon Mackay in Fremantle on the 7th of September 1879. They had 9 children, and in 1916 he farmed at Gonagoring as well as continuing building, and he was based at Subiaco in South Perth. Jesse died in Perth in February 1940 at the age of 83. And he did quite well for himself. There was a detailed article in the newspaper when he turned 80, and it says, an early pioneer, Mr. J.E. Hammond. Despite being 80 years old today, Mr. Jesse Hammond, an early colonist, writer and authority on Aboriginal customs, is comparatively youthful. That he still possesses a retentive memory and a sharp intellect will be realised when it's known that his second literary effort, an 80,000-word book titled Western Pioneers, will be published in Perth today. A further work, A Vocabulary of Native Words, contains 2,000 words by the Southwest tribe, about which he wrote in Wingen's People, his first book. A descendant of a pioneering family of the 30s, Mr. Hammond spent all of his life in this state. His grandfather, the late William Leader, after who Leaderville is named, built and owned the Freemasons Hotel. Mr. Hammond was born in a 2-storey residence on the present site of Temple Court Garage on the 6th of August 1856. Up until the age of 7, Mr. Hammond lived on the Perth waterfront and at Mongers Lake, his parents having a home at each of these places. The family later moved to Pinjarra for 5 years, and it was there he came into close contact with the Aborigines in their primitive state and learnt their ways and customs. He returned to Perth. He subsequently worked as a builder and contractor in many parts of the state, including the metropolitan area, Geraldton, Northam, and in the wheatbelt towns of Albany and Northampton, and retired from business 4 years ago. He was recently appointed a Protector of Aborigines for Western Australia. He had 9 children, 5 of whom are still living in various parts of the state, 23 grandchildren and 4 great-grandchildren. While Western Pioneers is not intended to be a work of literary distinction, it can claim to be one of the first books in which the intimate lives of the early settlers of the colony, their homes, their hardships and their pleasures have been described. The editor states in the foreword, Mr. Hammond has visited many parts of the state, and his breadth of vision and remarkable memory have enabled him to set out a most comprehensive study of old times, paying a tribute to the founders of the state. And her third sibling was Theophila Susanna Hammond, who was born in 1859 in Perth. She married Edward Kearns, an Englishman who'd arrived in Australia in 1882. He was a clerk at the Government Savings Bank. They married in Sydney on the 26th of March 1884, and she died in Auburn, New South Wales on the 12th of July 1935, aged 76. They had no children. So Alice came from quite a well-respected family in Western Australia. You could see that her siblings did very well for themselves. So Alice seemed to take on a very different path.
If you are interested in sharing your story on my podcast, Family History Mysteries, please go to my Facebook page and send me a message. If you would like some assistance in filling in the gaps in your family tree to see what mysteries you solve, please get in touch. And don't forget, you can have early access to episodes by subscribing, and you'll also gain access to bonus episodes.